For decades, our collective picture of the Second World War existed in shades of gray. But in recent years, those grainy archives have suddenly burst into high-definition color, complete with cinematic scores and immersive sound design. We have thousands of hours of footage and millions of pages of testimony detailing this conflict. Yet the generation that actually lived through it is almost entirely gone. Without their living voices to anchor us, the documentary film is shifting. What used to be a raw record of immediate experience is being funneled into highly structured, stylized media narratives, raising a critical question. As the distance between us and 1945 grows, how has the way we document the war changed over the last 50 years? To understand our modern memory of the conflict, we have to look at these films as the primary tools currently forging our collective history. In the 1970s, the blueprint for the modern historical series was drafted. Productions like The World at War stretched across 26 hours, aiming to capture the entire global scope of the conflict, while the veterans and political architects were still available to speak on camera. The filmmakers anchored this massive scale with sobering, understated narration. Voiced by actors like Sir Laurence Olivier, the scripts delivered precise facts without relying on the frantic pacing common in modern television. The editing structure moved methodically. Viewers would watch high-level strategic diplomacy between figures like Churchill and Roosevelt, and then the film would cut directly to the mud in the trenches. The impact came from unfiltered evidence. The cameras sat still as ordinary people recounted the brutality of combat and the horrors of the Holocaust, speaking about traumas that were still relatively fresh. By pairing the testimony of ordinary citizens and concentration camp inmates with high-level military maps, the series challenged simplistic, heroic narratives and highlighted the human cost of every strategic move. Because it acted as a direct vessel for the survivors, this era remains a foundational pillar for historians. It preserved history exactly as they lived it. 3 decades later, the documentary landscape faced a biological reality. By the mid-2000s, the veteran generation was rapidly passing away, creating a sense of urgency among filmmakers to capture the remaining stories. Directors like Ken Burns responded by narrowing their focus. Instead of mapping out global troop movements, series like The War zoomed in on specific towns like Mobile, Alabama, making the massive scale of the conflict feel deeply intimate. At the same time, international productions like Apocalypse leaned into a controversial technological leap to attract younger demographics: digital colorization. Historians point out a flaw in this process. Adding color requires filmmakers to make subjective choices about the exact shade of a uniform or a landscape, which can distort the visual truth of the original archival film. But the psychological argument for the technology is compelling. Colorizing the rubble and the blood shatters that detachment often felt when viewing black and white film, forcing audiences to recognize the terrifying reality. In this period, filmmakers traded strict archival objectivity for emotional accessibility, trying to keep a new century of viewers invested in a history that was slipping from living memory. Today, in the 2020s, we have crossed the threshold. The first-hand witnesses are largely gone, and historical media is now being designed for Gen Z and Gen Alpha audiences who consume information through entirely different formats. This shift culminates in massive blockbuster-style productions, like the 2026 epic World War II with Tom Hanks. The editorial techniques here are built for speed. Instead of dwelling on a single piece of evidence, these series rapidly cycle through opposing propaganda broadcasts and combat footage, constructing a fast-paced, multi-layered perspective of individual battles. But academic critics point out the cost of this format. To maintain that commercial pacing, deep historical analysis is often sacrificed in favor of broad accessibility. Highly complex geopolitical events and years of economic tension are zipped through at breakneck speeds. The resulting film acts as a high-budget introductory primer rather than a definitive, comprehensive record. It marks the completion of a long transition. The focus has shifted away from raw historical preservation, prioritizing scale, speed, and commercial viability. Documentaries act as the architects of our cultural memory, deciding which parts of the past are emphasized and which are left on the cutting room floor. A production that uses a top-down philosophy, focusing heavily on shifting borders and political treaties, teaches its audience to view the conflict coldly, as a strategic game of maps and operational maneuvers. Conversely, a bottom-up approach pulls the viewer into the surf and the mud. It forces audiences to confront the sheer human tragedy, focusing on the survival of ordinary civilians and the soldiers carrying rifles. The stakes for these stylistic choices are rising. As the last veterans leave us, these media constructions effectively become the defining lens through which the general public views the war. This means we have to consume these series as critical thinkers. We have to be aware of the invisible editing, the ideological slants, and the technological interventions that shape the narrative on the screen. Because ultimately, how we choose to film the past dictates exactly how the future will remember it.